I thought betrayal was something that happened to other people. Stories whispered at family gatherings, scandals you read about online. I never imagined it would walk into my home, sit at my dinner table, and smile at me like nothing was wrong. By the time I understood the truth, I had already lost the two people I trusted most. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to Hidden Chapters for more real-life stories and emotional insights. I used to believe my life was ordinary in the best possible way. Not perfect, not dramatic, just steady. The kind of life built on routine, familiar faces, and the comfort of knowing what tomorrow would look like. I was married to Daniel for 11 years. We lived in a quiet neighborhood where mornings smelled like brewed coffee and cut grass, and evenings ended with the low hum of the television and our dog curled up at our feet. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt safe. And for a long time, safety felt like love. My sister, Leah, was woven into that life as naturally as breathing. She was 3 years younger than me, brighter in some ways, louder in others. Where I was cautious, she was bold. Where I preferred listening, she filled rooms with laughter. Growing up, people always said we balanced each other. I believed that. I believed in us. When our parents passed within 2 years of each other, Leah and I leaned hard on that bond. Blood felt like a promise then, like something unbreakable. Sunday dinners were our tradition. Every week, Leah would come over just before sunset, usually with a bottle of wine tucked under her arm and some story she couldn't wait to tell. Daniel loved cooking for guests, and Leah loved being the guest. I can still see the three of us around the table, plates warm, voices overlapping. Daniel would tease Leah about her latest short-lived obsession, pottery 1 month, yoga the next, and she'd roll her eyes and call him predictable. I would watch them and feel grateful. Grateful that my husband and my sister got along so well. Grateful that my home felt full. Looking back, that gratitude is the hardest thing to sit with. At the time, nothing felt off, or maybe it did, but it was so subtle that my mind smoothed it over without effort. Daniel worked long hours then, or at least that's what he said. Leah had just gone through a breakup and spent more time with us than usual. I told myself it made sense. She was lonely, he was tired, life was busy. Life always is. There were small moments, though, moments that flickered at the edge of my awareness and disappeared before I could grab them. Leah texting Daniel directly instead of through our group chat. Daniel offering to pick Leah up when her car was in the shop, even though it meant driving across town. The way Leah would linger in the kitchen after dinner, laughing at something Daniel whispered while I loaded the dishwasher with my back turned. If someone had asked me then whether I trusted them, I would have laughed. Trusted them? They were my husband and my sister, the two people who knew me best, the two people who had seen me cry, who had held my hands at funerals, who had celebrated birthdays and promotions and quiet victories with me. Trust wasn't even a question. It was the air I breathed. I remember one particular evening clearly, though at the time it felt insignificant. We were all sitting in the living room, the lights low, rain tapping against the windows. Leah was curled up on one end of the couch, her feet tucked beneath her, Daniel on the other. I sat in my usual chair, flipping through my phone absent-mindedly. Leah told a story about a coworker who had embarrassed himself at a meeting, and Daniel laughed a little too hard. I looked up, and for just a second, their eyes met in a way that felt private. Not secretive exactly, just shared. I felt a small pinch in my chest. It passed quickly. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, people look at each other, people laugh together. That's normal. I'd been reading too many dramatic novels lately. That was my explanation. I accepted it without question. That was my pattern then, explaining things away, choosing the version of reality that required the least disruption. Daniel and I weren't unhappy, but we weren't newly in love either. Our marriage had settled into something quiet, comfortable. We talked about bills and groceries, about work stress and weekend plans. Intimacy had become scheduled, predictable. I told myself this was what long-term love looked like: steady, reliable. Leah, on the other hand, lived in a world of feelings and chaos. She craved intensity. I sometimes worried about her, worried she'd never find what she was looking for. It never crossed my mind that she might look for it in my life. There were nights Leah slept over, claiming it was too late to drive home. Daniel would make up the guest room, lay out fresh towels. I'd kiss him goodnight and fall asleep quickly, exhausted from the week. Sometimes I'd wake briefly to hear footsteps down the hall, a door opening or closing, the house settling. I never questioned it. Homes make noise. People move around. That's what homes do. The thing about betrayal is that it rarely announces itself. It doesn't knock on the door and ask to be let in. It slips quietly through cracks you didn't know were there, wearing familiar faces, speaking in voices you trust. If I'm honest, part of me sensed a shift long before I understood it. Daniel became more attentive in small ways, bringing me flowers on random days, offering to handle chores he used to avoid. Leah started complimenting me more than usual, telling me I looked beautiful, that I was lucky to have the life I did. Those gestures should have felt kind. Instead, they floated strangely, like apologies I hadn't earned yet. But I didn't press. I didn't ask. I didn't want to be the suspicious wife, the insecure sister. I'd built my identity around being reasonable, understanding, calm. I believed love meant trust, and trust meant not asking uncomfortable questions. So I kept setting the table, I kept pouring the wine, I kept opening my door every Sunday evening, smiling as my sister stepped inside, and my husband greeted her with an ease that felt at the time like family. I didn't know then that those dinners were rehearsals, that the laughter was layered over something darker, that while I was celebrating the closeness of my family, a devastating secret was growing quietly in the space between us. And that one ordinary day, one moment I never could have planned for, would unravel everything I thought I knew about loyalty, love, and the people I trusted most. Trust doesn't usually feel like a decision. It feels like a default setting, something you don't notice until it's gone. Back then, my trust in Leah and Daniel ran so deep that I didn't even recognize it as trust. It was just life. It was just the way things were. Leah started coming over more often during the week, not just Sundays. Sometimes she'd stop by after work, saying she didn't feel like being alone in her apartment. Other times, she'd text me midday, asking if I wanted company in the evening. I usually did. I was never someone who needed constant solitude, and having my sister around made the house feel lively. Daniel didn't object either. If anything, he seemed energized by her presence, suddenly more talkative, more animated than he'd been in months. I noticed how easily conversations flowed when the three of us were together. Leah would sit at the kitchen counter while Daniel cooked, their voices overlapping as if they were dancing around each other's sentences. I'd be at the table, answering emails or scrolling through my phone, listening with half an ear. Sometimes Daniel would ask Leah's opinion on things, recipes, work dilemmas, even small decisions about the house. It struck me as considerate. He valued her input. She was family. One evening, Leah helped Daniel wash the dishes while I took a phone call from work in the bedroom. When I came back out, the kitchen lights were dimmed and they were laughing quietly, shoulders angled toward each other. They both looked up at me at the same time, smiles a fraction too quick, as if they'd been startled. Daniel wiped his hands on a towel and kissed my cheek. Leah asked if I wanted tea. The moment passed. It always did. Looking back, I understand something I didn't then. Familiarity can disguise intimacy. When people are supposed to be close, siblings, spouses, you don't question the closeness. You assume it's harmless. You assume it has boundaries you don't need to see to believe in. Leah started confiding in Daniel more openly about her personal life. She talked about her fears of ending up alone, about how her last relationship had made her feel invisible. I listened from the couch while Daniel nodded, offering quiet reassurance. At one point, he said, "You deserve someone who really sees you." I remember feeling proud of him for being so kind. I remember thinking he'd make a great father someday, the way he listened without trying to fix everything. That night, after Leah left, I mentioned how nice it was that he was there for her. Daniel smiled, a little distracted, and said, "She's lucky to have you." The comment felt oddly misplaced, but I brushed it aside. People misspeak. People are tired. I didn't want to read into things. The truth is, part of me enjoyed how well they got along. It felt like proof that I had chosen well, not just a good partner, but someone who fits seamlessly into my family. Friends would comment on it too. "You're so lucky," they'd say. "Most sisters and husbands don't click like that." I would nod and agree, unaware of how fragile that sense of luck really was. As weeks passed, Daniel's schedule became less predictable. Late meetings, work trips that popped up unexpectedly. Leah, meanwhile, seemed to know his schedule better than I did. She'd casually mention, "Daniel said he'd be home late tonight," before I'd even heard from him. When I asked how she knew, she'd shrug and say he'd mentioned it in passing. It felt logical. They talked. Why wouldn't they? There was a night I couldn't sleep, my mind restless for no clear reason. I got up for water and noticed the light under the guest room door. Leah was staying over again. I paused in the hallway, listening. I heard voices, low, muffled, Daniel's laugh, Leah's softer tone. My stomach tightened, just a little. I told myself they were probably talking about something serious, about her breakup, about work. I didn't want to intrude. I went back to bed and stared at the ceiling until sleep finally claimed me. Psychologists talk about cognitive dissonance, the discomfort we feel when reality threatens a belief we rely on. I didn't know the term then, but I lived it. Every time something felt off, my mind rushed to protect the story I needed to believe. My sister would never hurt me. My husband would never betray me. Those truths were foundational. Without them, everything else would crack. Leah began to mirror me in subtle ways. She started wearing her hair styled similarly to mine, using the same phrases I did, even buying a perfume I'd worn for years. When I noticed and joked about it, she laughed and said she admired me. I felt flattered. I didn't consider the possibility that admiration can blur into something else. Daniel, on the other hand, grew quieter with me. Not distant exactly, just contained. Our conversations felt surface level. When I asked how his day was, he'd answer briefly, then retreat into his phone or the television. I told myself it was stress, midlife restlessness, another normal phase couples go through. I suggested a weekend away once. He said maybe another time. There was one afternoon when Leah and I went shopping together. We were standing in a fitting room hallway, mirrors everywhere, fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. Leah looked at me and said, "Do you ever worry that Daniel might get bored?" The question caught me off guard. I laughed it off, saying long marriages aren't about constant excitement. She nodded thoughtfully, too thoughtfully for my comfort, and said, "I guess some people just need to feel wanted." Her words stayed with me longer than they should have. That night, I tried to initiate intimacy with Daniel. He hesitated, said he was tired. I rolled onto my side, facing away from him, telling myself not to take it personally. Still, a quiet ache settled in my chest. Trust is reinforced by repetition. The more nothing happens, the more convinced you become that nothing ever will. Leah kept showing up, Daniel kept coming home, the house kept running on routine, and I kept believing. What I didn't realize is that trust can also be rehearsed, built deliberately, strengthened through shared secrets and private moments. Somewhere along the way, without my knowledge, a line had been crossed, maybe many lines, and while I was busy maintaining the story of my life, another one was unfolding right beside it. I was still standing in the calm before the storm, convinced that the ground beneath me was solid. I didn't know yet that the first real crack was already there, waiting for the smallest pressure to split everything wide open. The first undeniable sign didn't arrive with drama or confrontation. It came quietly, almost politely, on an afternoon that looked like any other. I was folding laundry in the bedroom, sunlight spilling through the window, when Daniel's phone buzzed on the nightstand. He was in the shower, the sound of running water steady and familiar. I wasn't in the habit of checking his phone. We'd always been open with our devices, but I'd never felt the need to look. Trust had made curiosity unnecessary. The screen lit up again and again. I glanced over, mostly out of irritation. Whoever it was seemed persistent. The name on the screen made my hands still in mid-fold. Leah. My first reaction wasn't suspicion, it was confusion. I assumed something was wrong. Maybe her car had broken down. Maybe she needed help. The message preview was short, but it didn't read like an emergency. It said, "I can't stop thinking about last night." I felt a sharp heat rise in my face, like embarrassment for seeing something private. My mind scrambled for an explanation that would make sense without threatening everything I believed. Last night, what? A long talk? A joke? Something emotional she'd shared? I set the shirt down slowly, my heart beating harder than it should have. The phone buzzed again. We have to be more careful. I didn't open the message. I didn't need to. The words sat there glowing on the screen, heavy and unmistakable. My body reacted before my thoughts could catch up. My stomach dropped. My ears rang. I felt suddenly unsteady, like the floor had tilted beneath me. Careful about what? I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. There always was. There had to be. But the longer I stood there staring at the phone, the more those words rearranged themselves into something I couldn't ignore. I stepped away from the bed just as Daniel turned off the shower. By the time you walked into the bedroom, towel around his waist, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, hands folded tightly in my lap. I must have looked pale because he stopped short when he saw me. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just tired." He glanced at his phone, picked it up, and something flickered across his face. It was subtle, gone in an instant, but I saw it. Guilt or fear or both. He slipped the phone into his pocket and started getting dressed, his movements a little rushed. That was the moment something inside me shifted, not enough to shatter yet, but enough to crack. For the rest of the day, I moved through my routines as if underwater. Every interaction felt distant, muffled. When Daniel kissed my cheek goodbye before leaving for work, I stiffened without meaning to. When Leah texted me later asking if I wanted to get coffee, my fingers hovered over the screen for a long time before I replied. I said yes. Part of me needed to look at her, to hear her voice, to see if I could find the truth in her face or if I was still imagining things. We met at a cafe we'd gone to 100 times before. Leah arrived first, already seated, her hair pulled back, a soft smile on her lips. She looked the same as always, comfortable, familiar. When she hugged me, it felt different. Her arms lingered a second longer than usual. I pulled away quickly, my heart racing. We talked about ordinary things, work, the weather, a show she'd been watching. I studied her hands as she spoke, the way she wrapped them around her coffee cup. She seemed nervous, fidgety. Or maybe that was my projection. Maybe I was the nervous one. Finally, I asked, as casually as I could, "Did you stay over the other night?" She nodded. "Yeah, you were already asleep." "Did you talk with Daniel?" My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Her eyes flicked up at mine, then away. "A bit. He was worried about you, about how stressed you've been." The lie, if it was one, was smooth, too smooth. It slid into place without effort. I nodded, pretending to accept it. Inside, my thoughts were racing. Last night? Careful? The way Daniel had looked at his phone? I didn't confront her then. Fear held me back. Confrontation would make things real, and I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I went home and began noticing things I'd once ignored. I noticed how Daniel angled his phone away from me when he texted, how he stepped outside to take calls, how he seemed to anticipate Leah's moods, checking in on her with a familiarity that felt intimate. I noticed how Leah mentioned things Daniel had said to her that he hadn't said to me. At night, lying beside him, I felt a distance I couldn't bridge. My mind replayed every shared laugh, every private glance. Memory became a weapon turning against me. Things I'd once found comforting now felt loaded with meaning. One evening, while Daniel was out, I went into the guest room to change the sheets. As I pulled them off the bed, something small and unfamiliar fell on the floor. A necklace. Delicate. Gold. Not mine. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. I recognized it immediately. I'd complimented Leah on it weeks earlier. I sat on the edge of the bed, the necklace pooled in my palm, and felt something inside me finally give way. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't coincidence. This was evidence. When Daniel came home, I asked him about it. I held the necklace up between us. He stared at it, his face draining of color. "It's Leah's," he said quietly. "I know. Why is it here?" He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Finally, he said, "She must have forgotten it." Forgotten it how? My voice was calm, but my hands were shaking. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw it, the truth sitting heavy in his eyes. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. That was when I knew, not everything, not the full extent, but enough to understand that something sacred had been violated, that the people I trusted most had crossed into a place they had no right to be. The world didn't end in that moment. It tilted slowly and cruelly, leaving me to struggle for balance as the ground beneath my feet began to crumble. Once you know something is wrong, your body seems to race ahead of your mind, bracing for impact. That night, after Daniel's silence answered more than his words ever could, I barely slept. I lay awake listening to the rhythm of his breathing, each inhale and exhale sounding unfamiliar, like a stranger had taken his place beside me. My thoughts circled relentlessly, trying to piece together a truth that felt too painful to fully imagine. Morning came softly, almost mockingly so. Sunlight crept through the curtains, birds chirped outside, and the world carried on as if nothing had changed. Daniel moved around the kitchen with quiet efficiency, making coffee, setting out mugs. The normalcy felt cruel. I watched him from the doorway, my chest tight, waiting for him to say something, to explain, to deny. He didn't. Finally, I spoke. "How long?" The word hung between us, heavy and unmistakable. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. He set the coffee pot down carefully, as if sudden movements might break something fragile. "It didn't mean anything," he said, not answering the question. I felt a sharp, hollow laugh escape me. "That's not what I asked." He ran a hand through his hair, eyes fixed on the counter. "A few months." A few months, the phrase echoed in my mind, colliding with memories of Sunday dinners, shared jokes, late-night conversations, months of deception layered over moments I had cherished. "While she was coming over here?" I asked. He nodded once. "It just happened." Those words, "it just happened," landed like an insult. Affairs don't happen the way accidents do. They're built, choice by choice, lie by lie. I felt anger rise, hot and immediate, but beneath it was something colder, grief. The realization that the life I thought I was living had been, in some ways, a performance. I asked him to tell me everything. All of it, and to my surprise, he did, not with dramatic confession, but with a subdued resignation that felt worse. He talked about feeling disconnected, about Leah understanding him in a way he hadn't expected, about late-night conversations that turned into something else. He didn't look proud. He didn't look remorseful either. He looked relieved to stop pretending. When he finished, I felt strangely calm. Numb, maybe. I told him I needed time, space. I went for a drive without a destination, tears blurring the road as reality finally settled. By the time I returned, the house felt hollow, as if it already knew it was losing something. I didn't call Leah right away. I needed to hear her voice, yes, but I also needed to protect myself from it. There's a particular pain in realizing that someone you love has been able to look you in the eye and lie repeatedly. I wasn't ready to face that. She called me that evening. Her name on my phone made my stomach twist. I answered. "Hey," she said softly, too softly. "Daniel told me." There was a pause on the line, long enough to confirm everything. "I was going to tell you," she whispered. "When? After how many more dinners? How many more nights in my house?" She started crying then, her voice breaking as she apologized, said she hadn't meant for it to go this far, said she loved me. Her words washed over me, hollow and insufficient. Love doesn't betray. Love doesn't hide in shadows and call it confusion. "Did you ever think about me?" "Yes," she said quickly, too quickly. "That's why I was so careful." Careful. The word from Daniel's phone echoed in my mind, sharp and cutting. Careful not to get caught. Careful not to disrupt the comfort I provided while they took what they wanted. I told her not to come over anymore, not to call. I needed distance. She agreed, her voice thick with tears. When the call ended, I sat alone in the quiet and felt the full weight of the loss crash down on me. Over the next few days, pieces of the truth surfaced everywhere. A forgotten earring in the car, a message thread I hadn't seen before, inside jokes that now made sickening sense. Each discovery felt like reopening a wound, preventing it from closing. Daniel tried, in his own limited way, to make amends. He apologized, he offered counseling, he said he wanted to fix things. I listened, but something essential had broken. Trust isn't just a feeling, it's a foundation, and ours had crumbled. The hardest part wasn't the anger, it was the humiliation, knowing that my sister and my husband had shared something intimate while I smiled and poured wine for them, that my home had been the backdrop for my own betrayal. Shame wrapped itself around me, whispering that I should have known, that I was foolish for believing in them so completely. Psychologically, betrayal trauma cuts deep because it threatens our sense of reality. The people we rely on to keep us safe become the source of danger. I felt unmoored, questioning my judgment, my memories, even my identity. Who was I if I couldn't trust my own perceptions? One night, alone in the living room, I replayed a video on my phone from months earlier, a family gathering, all of us laughing. Leah leaned against Daniel, her hand resting casually on his arm. At the time, I'd seen closeness. Now I saw intimacy. The reinterpretation of memory was relentless. Eventually, I confronted Leah in person. We met at a park, neutral ground. She looked small, diminished, nothing like the confident woman I'd always known. She tried to explain, to frame it as mutual loneliness, as a mistake fueled by vulnerability. I listened quietly, then told her something that surprised even me. "You didn't just betray me, you replaced me." She shook her head, crying, "No, never." But that's what affairs like this do. They take the roles, the intimacy, the trust that belong to someone else. They rewrite boundaries and pretend nothing's been stolen. When we parted, there was no dramatic ending, just a quiet understanding that our relationship, as it had been, was over. Some things can't be repaired, no matter how much history you share. As I walked away, I felt grief, yes, but also clarity. The truth was out now. The secret was no longer for me to carry. And while the pain was immense, it marked the end of deception and the beginning of something else, something unknown, something I would have to face alone. After the truth surfaced, time stopped behaving normally. Days stretched endlessly, heavy and colorless, while weeks blurred together as if my mind refused to catalog them. I moved through my life on autopilot, performing the basic tasks of living, eating, sleeping, showering, without fully inhabiting them. The emotional impact didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves, unpredictable and relentless. In the first wave, there was shock. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but a dull disbelief that wrapped around me like fog. I would forget for brief moments what had happened. I'd reach for my phone to text Leah something trivial or plan dinner assuming Daniel would be home, and then the memory would crash back in. Each realization felt like losing them all over again. Then came anger. Deep, consuming anger that frightened me with its intensity. I was angry at Daniel for his choices, at Leah for her betrayal, and at myself for not seeing it sooner. I replayed conversations in my head, scrutinizing every word, every glance. How could I have been so blind? The question haunted me, though intellectually I knew the answer. Trust makes us blind by design. We don't constantly scan for danger among those we love. I stopped sleeping properly. Nights were the worst. In the quiet, my mind turned ruthless, replaying images I didn't want but couldn't stop imagining. Daniel and Leah together, in my home, in my bed. I'd sit up suddenly, heart pounding, as if my body were trying to escape a threat that was no longer present, but still very real to my nervous system. Daniel moved into the guest room at my request. The physical distance helped, but the emotional one felt insurmountable. We spoke sparingly, mostly about logistics, bills, the dog, work schedules. Every mundane exchange underscored how profoundly things had changed. Sometimes he'd look at me with what I think was regret, and I'd feel a flicker of something, sadness maybe, but it never softened the truth of what he'd done. I didn't tell many people at first. The thought of explaining, of seeing pity or shock in their eyes felt unbearable. There's a unique vulnerability in admitting you've been betrayed by both a spouse and a sibling. It feels like a public declaration of failure, even though it isn't, even though betrayal says more about the betrayer than the betrayed. When I finally told a close friend, the words came out flat, rehearsed. She gasped, then hugged me so tightly I nearly broke down. That's when I realized how much I'd been holding in. Grief needs witnesses. Pain needs to be acknowledged to begin healing. Leah tried reaching out again during this time. Messages, emails, voicemails filled with apologies and explanations. I didn't respond, not because I wanted to punish her, but because I needed to protect myself. Boundaries are often mistaken for cruelty. In reality, they're an act of self-preservation. I began to see a therapist, something I'd never done before. In those sessions, I learned about betrayal trauma and how deeply it can affect one's sense of self. My reactions, Hypervigilance, emotional numbness, sudden bursts of rage weren't signs of weakness. They were normal responses to an abnormal violation of trust. One concept stood out to me, that when betrayal comes from someone close, our brains struggle to integrate the experience. We need our attachment figures to feel safe, so when they become the source of harm, the mind fractures the reality to survive. That's why denial is so powerful, why I had explained away so many warning signs. My mind had been protecting me until it couldn't anymore. Despite this understanding, the pain remained. I grieved not only the loss of my marriage and my sister, but the loss of the future I had imagined, children we might have had, holidays we'd planned, growing old together. Those dreams dissolved, leaving an ache that felt personal and universal. I started taking long walks alone, letting my thoughts unravel in the open air. Sometimes I cried. Sometimes I felt nothing at all. Slowly, I began to notice small moments of relief, a deep breath that didn't hurt, a laugh that surprised me. These moments didn't erase the pain, but they reminded me I was still alive within it. Daniel eventually asked if we could try couples counseling. I considered it seriously, not because I believed things could return to what they were, but because I needed clarity. In the sessions, he spoke about his regrets, his confusion, his desire to rebuild trust. I listened, weighing his words against his actions. Healing requires accountability, and while he expressed remorse, something fundamental was missing. I didn't feel safe. One afternoon, after a particularly draining session, I sat in my car and realized the truth I'd been avoiding. Love without trust isn't love, it's endurance, and I was tired of enduring. As for Leah, the loss of our relationship cut differently. She wasn't just someone I loved, she was part of my history, my childhood, my identity. Letting go of her felt like losing a limb. I mourned the sister I thought I had, the one who would never have crossed that line. Accepting that she was capable of this betrayal forced me to reevaluate our entire relationship. Self-respect became a quiet mantra for me during this time. I repeated it when guilt tried to pull me back into old patterns, when loneliness tempted me to accept apologies that didn't come with true accountability. Self-respect meant choosing myself, even when it hurt. The emotional processing wasn't linear. Some days I felt strong, resolved. Other days I felt shattered all over again. Healing, I learned, isn't about moving on quickly. It's about allowing the pain to move through you without letting it define you. By the end of that season, something within me had shifted. The shock had worn off, replaced by a clearer, steadier resolve. I wasn't healed, not even close, but I was ready to stop being passive, ready to take action, to reclaim agency over my life and my future. And that realization marked the end of my collapse and the beginning of my confrontation with the truth. There's a quiet moment that comes after grief, when the tears slow and the anger loses its sharpest edge. It's not peace, not yet, but it's clarity. That was where I found myself one morning, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, realizing I couldn't stay suspended in indecision any longer. Something had to change. I had to move from reacting to choosing. The first step was asking Daniel to leave the house for a while. Not as a punishment, not dramatically, but because I needed space to think without his presence constantly reopening wounds. When I told him, my voice shook, but my words were steady. He didn't argue. He nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting it, and packed a bag that same afternoon. Watching him walk out the door felt surreal. This was the man I'd built a life with, now reduced to a suitcase and a quiet goodbye. Once the house was mine again, truly mine, I began to investigate, not obsessively, but deliberately. I needed the full truth, not because I wanted to torture myself, but because partial truths leave room for doubt. Doubt keeps you stuck. I went through old messages, emails, calendars. I reconstructed timelines. Each discovery hurt, but it also grounded me. The affair wasn't a vague fear anymore. It was concrete, contained by facts. What surprised me was how empowering that process felt. Knowledge, even painful knowledge, restored a sense of control I hadn't realized I'd lost. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined it. My instincts had been right, even if I'd ignored them at first. I also confronted Leah one final time. Not to argue, not to seek closure from her. That kind of closure rarely comes, but to speak my truth without interruption. We met at her apartment. The space felt unfamiliar, like stepping into a version of her life I'd never been invited into. She looked nervous when she opened the door, her eyes scanning my face as if bracing for impact. I told her I didn't want explanations or apologies anymore. I told her how deeply her actions had wounded me, how they had fractured my sense of family and safety. I told her that trust, once broken at this level, doesn't reset with time or tears. She cried quietly, but she listened. When I finished, I said something that felt like drawing a line in the sand. "I need distance," I said, "not to punish you, to protect myself." She nodded, wiping her face. "I understand." I wasn't sure she did fully, but understanding wasn't required. Respect was. After that, I shifted my focus inward. I met with a lawyer to understand my options, not because I wanted revenge, but because I needed to know where I stood. Knowledge, again, became a form of stability. I learned what separation would look like, what my rights were, what the process might entail if I chose to leave. For the first time since the betrayal, I felt like I was planning a future instead of mourning a past. Daniel and I had several long conversations during this period. Not fights, those had lost their energy, but honest discussions. He admitted things he hadn't before, how the secrecy had given him a sense of escape, how he'd compartmentalized his guilt to function, how he hadn't fully considered the consequences until everything came crashing down. Listening to him, I felt a strange mix of empathy and detachment. I could understand his psychology without excusing his behavior. That distinction became important to me. Understanding is not the same as forgiving, and forgiving is not the same as reconciling. I started rebuilding routines that belonged only to me. Morning walks, cooking meals Daniel never liked, rearranging furniture simply because I wanted a change. These small acts of autonomy reminded me that my identity wasn't defined by my marriage or my role as a sister. I was still myself. Wounded, yes, but intact. Emotionally, I noticed a shift as well. The constant knot in my chest loosened slightly. I still had bad days, moments when grief surged unexpectedly, but they no longer consumed me entirely. I could feel sadness without drowning in it. That felt like progress. One evening, Daniel asked me directly if I thought we could ever repair things. I took a long time to answer. When I did, my voice was calm. I don't know how to repair trust when the betrayal came from two directions, and I don't know how to unsee what I've seen. He nodded, eyes downcast. I understand. That was the closest we came to closure as a couple, not a dramatic ending, but a quiet acknowledgement of reality. As weeks passed, the consequences of the affair rippled outward. Family members began to sense something was wrong. Questions were asked. I chose honesty, but selectively. I told people what they needed to know, nothing more. I refused to carry shame that wasn't mine. Leah withdrew from family gatherings. Daniel kept his distance. The structure of my life changed visibly and permanently. And yet, beneath the loss, there was a growing sense of alignment. My actions matched my values. My boundaries reflected my self-worth. Psychologically, this phase marked a reclaiming of agency. Betrayal strips you of choice. Healing restores it. Each decision I made, from who I spoke to how I spent my time, reinforced the idea that I was no longer at the mercy of someone else's deception. I wasn't healed, I wasn't happy, but I was no longer powerless. And in that quiet strength, I began to see the outline of a future that, while different from the one I had imagined, might still hold meaning, dignity, and peace. The truth has a way of surfacing no matter how carefully it's buried. I learned that as the consequences of the affair began to reach beyond the three of us and into the wider circle of family and friends. What had once been a private devastation slowly became a shared reality, and with it came reactions I hadn't anticipated. My extended family noticed first. Holidays arrived and Daniel wasn't by my side. Leah stopped answering group messages, stopped showing up to birthdays and casual get-togethers. People asked questions gently at first, then more directly. I chose my words carefully, not out of secrecy, but out of self-respect. I said there had been a serious breach of trust. I said I needed space. Eventually, I said the truth. The reactions were immediate and intense. Shock, disbelief, anger, often on my behalf. Some family members confronted Leah, others avoided her entirely. I didn't take pleasure in watching her face the consequences of her actions, but I didn't shield her either. Accountability isn't cruelty. It's a necessary part of repair, even when repair isn't possible. Daniel faced his own reckoning. Mutual friends pulled away, unsure how to navigate the situation. Some reached out to me privately, offering support, expressing disappointment in him. He told me later how isolating it felt, how the secrecy that once felt thrilling now left him alone. I listened without satisfaction. Consequences are meant to be felt. What surprised me most was how people responded to me. There was compassion, yes, but also projection. Some women whispered their own fears into my ear, stories of betrayal they'd suspected but never confirmed. Others asked questions that stung, whether they meant to or not. Did you see any signs? Do you think you could have done something differently? Those questions revealed more about our culture than about my situation. We're still uncomfortable placing responsibility where it belongs. Through it all, I worked to stay grounded. Therapy helped, writing helped, naming my emotions helped. I learned that healing isn't about erasing anger or sadness, but about integrating them without letting them dominate your life. Leah eventually sent a long letter, pages of reflection, remorse, and self-analysis. She wrote about her insecurities, her loneliness, her regret. I read it once, carefully, then put it away. Her feelings were valid, so were mine, but her understanding of herself didn't undo the harm she caused. I responded with a brief note. I acknowledged her apology. I reiterated my need for distance. I wished her healing. That was all I could offer without betraying myself. Daniel and I reached a turning point around the same time. Practical matters forced our hands, finances, the house, legal decisions we could no longer postpone. We met with lawyers separately, then together. The conversations were respectful, almost businesslike. Emotion had burned through itself, leaving clarity behind. We decided to separate formally. The word felt heavy, final, but also strangely relieving. There would be no more ambiguity, no more maybe. Choosing an ending allowed something else to begin. Moving out was harder than I expected, packing up years of shared life, photos, souvenirs, inside jokes embedded in objects, felt like dismantling a version of myself. I kept some things, let others go. Each decision was a small act of mourning. Once the separation was public, the social dynamics shifted again. Invitations changed, people chose sides or tried not to. I learned quickly who could hold space for complexity and who needed things to be simple. I gravitated toward the former. There was a moment, weeks later, when I ran into Leah unexpectedly at a grocery store. Our eyes met across an aisle of cereal boxes. Time slowed. For a second, I saw the sister I'd grown up with, the girl who shared my room, my secrets, my childhood. Then the present rushed back in. We exchanged a brief nod, nothing more. As I walked away, my chest tightened, but I didn't crumble. I felt sad, yes, but also strong. Healing doesn't mean the absence of pain, it means the presence of resilience. Daniel and I had one final conversation before fully parting ways. We sat at the same table where we'd once shared so many meals, now divided by an invisible line. He apologized again, more clearly this time, without excuses. He took responsibility. I accepted the apology, not as a promise of forgiveness, but as an acknowledgement of truth. He said, "I hope you find happiness." I replied, "I hope you learn from this." It wasn't unkind, it was honest. As the dust settled, I found myself alone in a new way, not abandoned, but independent. The silence in my home felt different now, less oppressive, more open. I began to imagine possibilities that had nothing to do with them. Psychologically, this phase represented integration. The trauma was no longer the center of my identity. It was part of my story, not the whole of it. I could think about the future without everything looping back to betrayal. Justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like truth being acknowledged, boundaries being respected, and lives being redirected. In that sense, justice was unfolding quietly around me. I didn't feel triumphant, I felt steady, and for a first time in a long while, that was enough. Closure doesn't arrive with fireworks or final speeches. It comes quietly, in moments you don't immediately recognize as turning points. For me, it arrived on an ordinary afternoon, months after everything had come apart. I was sitting alone in my living room, sunlight stretching across the floor, when I realized I hadn't thought about Leah or Daniel all day. Not once. The absence of that constant ache felt almost unfamiliar. That's when I understood something important. Healing isn't about forgetting. It's about no longer organizing your life around the wound. The separation was finalized not long after. Papers were signed, names untangled from shared accounts, responsibilities clearly divided. I expected the finality to feel devastating, but instead it felt grounding. The ambiguity had been far more painful than the ending itself. Endings, at least, have edges. You know where they are. On the day everything became official, I went for a long walk by myself. The air was crisp, the sky clear in a way that made the world feel larger than my pain. I let myself grieve one last time, not just the marriage, not just my sister, but the version of myself who had believed loyalty was guaranteed by proximity. I thanked her silently for loving deeply, even if it had cost her. People often talk about revenge fantasies after betrayal, the desire to see those who hurt you suffer. I won't pretend those thoughts never crossed my mind, but what surprised me was how little satisfaction they offered once I began to heal. Watching others face consequences didn't restore what I'd lost. It didn't give me back my trust or my sense of safety. Only rebuilding myself could do that. Instead of revenge, I found something quieter and more enduring: self-respect. I honored my boundaries even when it was uncomfortable. I declined invitations that felt forced. I stopped explaining myself to people who wanted neat narratives. I let silence do some of the work words couldn't. Leah reached out again during this time, cautiously, respectfully. She asked if there was any chance, someday, of rebuilding a relationship. I sat with that question for a long time, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to answer from a place of honesty rather than hurt. When I finally responded, I told her the truth, that I didn't know what the future held, that forgiveness, if it ever came, would take time, that trust, especially between sisters, isn't something you ask for, it's something you earn through consistent behavior over years, not months. She accepted that, quietly. It was the first interaction between us that didn't feel manipulative or defensive. Whether it would ever lead to reconciliation, I didn't know, but I felt at peace with leaving the question open. What mattered more was the relationship I was rebuilding with myself. I started noticing how my body responded to safety again, how laughter came easier, how I could enjoy moments without scanning for threats. My nervous system, once on high alert, slowly began to settle. Therapy continued to play a role, but so did ordinary joys. Cooking for myself, reading in the evenings, saying no without guilt. These weren't dramatic transformations, but they were profound. Trauma often steals your sense of choice. Healing restores it in small, cumulative ways. I learned something else, too. Something uncomfortable but freeing. Loyalty is not proven by blood or vows alone. It's proven by behavior, especially when temptation or hardship appears. And self-worth isn't measured by who chooses you, but who you choose to keep in your life. There were moments of sadness still, anniversaries that passed quietly, family events that felt incomplete. But those moments no longer defined me. They were chapters, not the entire book. One evening, as I was cleaning out a drawer, I found an old photo of Leah and me as children. We were smiling, arms wrapped around each other, unaware of how complicated life would become. I held the photo for a while, letting myself feel both love and loss at the same time. Then I put it away, not hidden, but placed gently among other memories. That felt right. Justice, I realized, isn't always about restoring what was taken. Sometimes it's about refusing to let the betrayal take anything more. My dignity remained intact, my values were clearer than ever, my future was still mine to shape. As I moved forward, I did so without bitterness, not because what happened didn't matter, but because I refused to let it harden me. I could be cautious without being closed, strong without being cold. The story didn't end with everything neatly resolved. Life rarely does. But it ended with something better than revenge or regret. It ended with acceptance, growth, and a quiet confidence that I would be okay, no matter what relationships came or went. And that, in the end, felt like the truest form of closure. With time and distance, reflection becomes possible. Not the kind that reopens wounds, but the kind that gently examines them, trying to understand how they formed and what they changed. By the time I reached this stage, the rawness had softened enough for insight to emerge. I could finally look back without being pulled under by what I saw. I began asking myself deeper questions, not the self-blaming ones that had dominated my early grief, but honest, curious ones. Why had I ignored my instincts for so long? Why did loyalty feel like an obligation rather than a choice in my family? Why had I equated peace with silence? The answers weren't flattering, but they were illuminating. I realized I had been raised to value harmony above truth. Growing up, conflict was something to be smoothed over quickly, not explored. Feelings were acknowledged only if they didn't disrupt the balance. I learned early that being the reasonable one earned approval.
That lesson followed me into adulthood, shaping how I showed up in my marriage and in my relationship with my sister. Psychologically, this pattern made me vulnerable. When something felt wrong, my instinct wasn't to question it, it was to minimize it, to rationalize, to keep things calm. Betrayal thrives in environments where discomfort is avoided at all costs. I also reflected on the dynamic between Leah and me. I had always been the stable one, the caretaker, the quiet anchor. She had always been the seeker, the one searching for validation and intensity. Those roles worked until they didn't. When she crossed a boundary that should have been unthinkable, it wasn't because I was lacking. It was because she was chasing something she didn't know how to build for herself. Understanding this didn't excuse her actions, but it released me from the burden of personalizing them. Betrayal often feels like a statement about your worth. In reality, it's more often a reflection of someone else's unhealed wounds and poor boundaries. I thought deeply about trust, too. Trust, I learned, isn't blind faith, it's informed confidence. It grows through consistency, transparency, and accountability. I had offered trust freely, assuming it would be protected simply because it was given. Now I understood that trust is relational. It must be earned and maintained on both sides. One of the most painful lessons was recognizing that love alone is not enough to sustain a relationship. Love without respect becomes self-sacrifice. Love without boundaries becomes self-erasure. I had loved deeply, but I hadn't always protected myself. As these insights settled, something shifted in how I saw my past, not as a series of mistakes, but as a progression of lessons I hadn't yet learned. That reframing was powerful. It allowed me to hold compassion for my former self instead of judgment. I also reflected on forgiveness, a concept people often misunderstand. Forgiveness isn't reconciliation, it isn't forgetting, and it certainly isn't excusing harm. For me, forgiveness meant releasing the expectation that Leah or Daniel would ever fully understand the depth of what they'd done. It meant reclaiming my emotional energy from a past I could no longer change. There were days when resentment resurfaced, quietly and unexpectedly. When it did, I treated it as information, not failure. Healing isn't a straight line. Old emotions don't disappear, they lose their power gradually. I began to notice how my relationships changed as a result of this experience. I became more discerning, more honest, less afraid of difficult conversations. I stopped over-explaining my needs. I trusted myself to walk away when something didn't feel right. Friends commented on the change. They said I seemed calmer, clearer, more grounded. I felt it too, not because I had become harder, but because I had become more anchored in who I was. The psychological impact of betrayal doesn't end when the relationship does. It reshapes how you understand safety, intimacy, and self-worth, but it can also be transformative. Post-traumatic growth is real, the ability to emerge from adversity with deeper insight, resilience, and authenticity. I didn't wish the experience away anymore, not because I was grateful for the pain, but because I respected the growth it had forced upon me. I had learned to listen to my intuition, to honor my boundaries, to recognize that loyalty begins with self-respect. As I looked toward the future, I no longer asked whether betrayal would happen again. I asked whether I trusted myself to respond if it did. And the answer, finally, was yes. That confidence didn't come from certainty. It came from knowing I could survive loss, rebuild meaning, and choose myself without guilt. This part of the journey wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, internal, deeply personal, but it was essential. Reflection turned pain into wisdom, experience into understanding. And understanding, I learned, is one of the most powerful forms of healing there is.
Moving forward didn't mean starting over from nothing. It meant starting from truth. By the time I reached this chapter of my life, the shock had faded, the grief had softened, and the lessons had settled into something solid. I wasn't the same person I'd been before the betrayal, but I wasn't broken either. I was reshaped. I began to notice how differently I carried myself. There was a quiet confidence in my steps, a steadiness in my voice that hadn't been there before. I no longer rushed to fill silences or smooth over discomfort. If something felt wrong, I let that feeling exist. I trusted it. That trust in myself was perhaps the greatest redemption of all. My life grew simpler but richer. I cultivated routines that nourished me instead of distracting me. Morning light became something I noticed again. Music moved me in ways it hadn't during the numb months. I laughed more freely, not because everything was perfect, but because joy no longer felt dangerous. I had learned that pain doesn't mean happiness will disappear forever. It means it will return in a different form, deeper and more honest. I reconnected with parts of myself I'd neglected: creativity, curiosity, stillness. I traveled alone for the first time, discovering that solitude didn't equal loneliness. In fact, it felt like freedom. I could choose where to go, when to leave, what to feel, without checking in with anyone else's expectations. My relationship with family evolved too. Some bonds grew stronger, rooted in honesty and mutual respect. Others faded quietly. I no longer chased closeness at the expense of my well-being. I understood now that distance isn't always rejection. Sometimes it's clarity. Leah remained at the edge of my life, not fully gone, not fully present. We exchanged occasional updates, polite and careful. I no longer expected her to be the sister I once believed she was. That expectation had caused too much pain. Instead, I allowed her to be who she was and allowed myself to decide how much access that warranted. Forgiveness, I realized, doesn't require proximity. As for love, I approached it differently. I didn't rush. I didn't look for someone to complete me or repair what had been broken. I looked for compatibility, consistency, emotional safety. I listened to actions more than words. When I did eventually open my heart again, it was with boundaries intact and self-respect firmly in place. Psychologically, this was the final integration. Trauma no longer sat at the center of my identity. It became a chapter, important, formative, but not defining. I could speak about what happened without reliving it. I could remember without trembling. That's how I knew healing had taken root. There is a myth that betrayal ruins you forever, that once trust is broken, it can never be rebuilt. I no longer believe that. Betrayal doesn't destroy your capacity to trust. It reveals where trust belongs. It teaches discernment. It sharpens intuition. It asks you to choose yourself, sometimes for the first time. The moral of my story isn't about blame or bitterness. It's about truth. Blood relations don't guarantee loyalty. Marriage doesn't guarantee fidelity. What guarantees nothing is entitlement. What protects you is awareness, boundaries, and self-worth. If you're listening to this and you've been betrayed by a partner, a sibling, someone you never imagined could hurt you, I want you to know this: their actions do not define your value. The way you respond, the way you heal, the way you choose yourself afterward, that's where your power lives. I didn't lose everything when I lost my marriage and my sister. I lost illusions, and in their place, I gained clarity, resilience, and a deeper relationship with myself than I'd ever known. I still believe in love. I still believe in connection, but now I believe first in me. This is my story. This is what shaped me, and this is what I learned.